Hello, and welcome to the Schmidt List, the podcast for people dedicated to managing successful projects, developing impactful products, and building engaged teams. And now, here's your host, Kurt Schmidt.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 31. This week, we're talking project management with Adam Hanson. Adam and I go over kind of what it's like to manage onshore teams versus offshore teams, how to handle if you feel like your team is out of alignment, how to also manage people who don't report to you, and all the above. So it's a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. And I've got some announcements on the other side. But for now, take a listen to my conversation with Adam. Adam, thanks for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
So tell me a little bit about your background. How did you get into what you're doing these days?
It's an interesting question that I ask myself sometimes. And it's a question that I often ask people that I'm interviewing too, right? Because nobody ever, gets out of college and goes, I'm going to be a project manager, program manager, right? So
right.
I actually have a finance degree and a music performance degree from the University of Minnesota. Mm-hmm. Started as a financial analyst for a defense contractor here in town. Liked that work. It was interesting work, but for a while it got to be a little bit monotonous. And so I got into consulting with a small consulting firm, doing primarily work in the financial services industry. It was acquisition integration work. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of that ended up being very closely tied to technology platform builds for these big financial services companies. So I did that for a while out in New York and came back to a local firm here, worked with you for a while at our previous home. And
yep.
Found that software project management is actually extremely interesting.
Yeah.
And you get to build a lot of cool stuff. You get to work with a lot of really smart people. So my career has progressed into, more complex projects, programs, all the way into things like business transformation efforts. And so,
it's great.
Here we are.
Well, and you've had the benefit and the opportunity to work on some very large projects, but also small projects, mm-hmm. right? So if you were coaching somebody who's listening to this and maybe they're on average working on a smaller project, and I'm just going to throw out a number there, like sub 1,000 hours, right?
Sure.
A worth of work, or I don't know, points or something. I don't know. I don't know how to calculate that. But anyways, if you were going to coach somebody and they really wanted to move into larger projects, they wanted to move from I'm doing this sort of smaller, pieces. Maybe I've got 3 or 4 projects on my plate, but I want to move into one big giant one, right?
Right.
What are some either characteristics or skill sets or attributes or things that you would coach them on, things that they need to work on in order to make that transition?
I think one of the really big things, and I think a lot of us struggle with it, especially as we talk about project management, as we focus on specific issues or specific problems or specific deliverables that need to be fixed. And I think we often fail to stop and level up and say, okay, why is our client or why is our company or why are they building the thing that they're building, right? So if we can level up and put everything into context, even if it is a very small project, they're not just building something because it's fun. There's a business need that precipitated that. So if you can figure out what that is, mm-hmm. talk about it in that way, you can start to impress upon your stakeholders or your clients that you really understand their business and where that piece fits in. And I think for project managers and product managers and program managers, that's especially important because if somebody can trust that you not only understand their technical solution, but you understand the business context in which it fits, they will trust you with more. Mm-hmm. They will look to you for more.
Yeah, and I've had this discussion. I recently had on Ned Johnson on the show, who's a SVP of project management. They have a ton of project managers at GTB, big agency in Michigan. And he talked about the future of project management was one of the discussions we were having. The future needs to be where the project manager is a more strategic resource within the organization other than just a Gantt jockey, right? But what does that really mean? I understand when you say I have to have a good understanding from a business sense about why we're doing it and what maybe the financial impact or outcome needs to be. But what about with the team? Like if you're working with a team of 20, 30 people when before maybe you had 3 or 4 people, how does that translate into working with those larger teams, being that strategic person?
That's another really interesting question, and I think there's a number of different ways we could go with that. But I think especially as you start to work with larger teams, you're going to work with more diverse sets of stakeholders, and those might be people who have to provide inputs, or they're going to be interested in an output of your project. But I really do think that the more you can put things into context, the more, especially as we talk about project and program managers needing to think more strategically, they'll know which people they need to tie into the process at different points in time, right? So I think about a recent experience that I had at a client here locally who thought they were very agile in terms of their delivery. And I think, when we talk about that they think they were empowering teams to make their own product decisions and make their own development decisions and move forward in a way that provided value in the most, timely and efficient way, right? I mean, that's what we're all going for when we talk about agile delivery. We want to be able to respond to customer needs, but we thought about where that fit in the organization and where this team sat. I was able to map out dependencies on 11 other teams, right? And that's something that their delivery teams hadn't thought about because it was just kind of the way that they did it. And it wasn't until they were able to see it sort of like, our strategy has to change if we're going to build these solutions iteratively and quickly respond to changes in market demand or customer need, or we discover that something isn't technically feasible. If we have to be dependent on 9, 10, 11 other teams every time we want to do that, we're going to fail. Yeah. So I think when you talk about project managers and program managers needing to think more strategically, I think it's knowing where those pitfalls are and knowing how to get people to think differently about how to approach those situations.
I like that you brought up dependencies, because I feel like that in general for me was a big turning point in my earlier project management career. Was I saw other PMs finding out certain dependencies and then just accepting them for face value, because it's not my job to start going down those rabbit holes, right? But I found that the more that I did start creeping into those things, the more I learned about how the business worked. I learned more about what the real priorities were. Not to say that they were completely false before, but they were definitely askew from my original understanding.
For sure.
And as I checked and started going down those dependencies and figuring out whose job it was to provide what and when they were planning on providing it, and then being able to be that person that helped start to craft a more holistic solution versus just, a critical path to follow.
Right. Well, and I think that's an interesting point, right? Because you mentioned like Gantt and jockey, right? And I think we've all been in a situation where we're putting together a project plan and we're looking at all the finish to start dependencies and trying to figure out what our critical path is. And I think, again, we start focusing on the tasks themselves and not the overall desired outcome of whatever thing it is that we're doing. And if you can't separate the tasks from that, right, you end up getting very sort of myopically focused on just doing the things on the page in front of you, rather than saying, I've got this dependency. Is there another way that I could get my stakeholder, my client, to that same outcome while not having to rely on this hard dependency? Or is it really a hard dependency that I can't get around?
What would you say to a PM that maybe is feeling that way but is not getting that traction when they are bringing those solutions to somebody, right? Maybe there's a product manager that's like, hey, stay in your lane. This is my gig. How do you coach somebody around that if they're trying to move and be more strategic, but people are not looking at their role as that sort of input?
That's a really hard question. And I
think on purpose.
And I think it appreciate that. You put me in literally in the hot seat here.
That's why I have smart people on the show, because they answer the hard questions.
I have often resulted to meetings or workshops in which you bring a broader group of stakeholders together. And this is a thing that's kind of helpful to do periodically, I think, to realign on that why, on that what's the business problem, what's the outcome we're looking for.
To see if it's changed.
And I think, generally it's important if everybody that's involved, even if it's tangentially involved in an effort like that, sort of understands the overall mission and objectives and desired outcomes, it's easier to understand their motivations or reasons behind why they're making certain decisions. And so, to go to your product owner example, if they're just saying, hey, stay out of my way, this is my job, and stay in your lane and do your thing, that could be because they don't trust the input, or they're worried about how they're going to look in front of their boss, or a myriad other things that you may not have visibility to. So I think having those broader alignment sessions are really important, because it allows everybody to step back and sort of reflect on, why are we doing this? What's the best approach? Are we all on track to getting to the right goal that we're looking for? But it also gives you something to anchor back to, right?
Yeah.
Because I do think that we often sort of assume what others are thinking, right?
Yeah.
But the other thing I often do is sort of just probe, why a lot, especially with product people, because I think, and I'm sure you've worked with folks like this who have a vision in their minds of how they want to work or want something to work. But the more you dig into it, they're looking for something else.
Yeah.
Or something else might meet the need.
Right. They might not have the language to describe what they're actually looking for, or they'll know it when they see it. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a problem when you're trying to deliver on exact specifications or exact feature sets or things of that nature, right? So let's flip the gears just a bit and go and talk about working with development teams. So like I had mentioned, you've had the experience of working with some very large teams on premises, overseas, the whole shebang. You've worked with a lot of different groups. But if you were to say there were some challenges, I'm sure there always is. It's projects,
Never.
right?
Never. No, I've never had a challenge ever.
Oh, good. Well, this is why you're successful. This is why these questions should be easy for you. So I want to talk a bit about working with engineers. So there's times when I've worked with engineers that don't maybe respect the project manager position.
Sure.
They feel it's kind of not needed. If they just were left to their own devices, they would just get the stuff done. They don't need a stand-up. They don't need a retrospective, right? They don't need any of those things. How do you coach people when they come with that sort of attitude into a larger team, or any team, really, to be honest?
I think the really hard thing with some people in that situation is to help them realize that it isn't necessarily about them. I've certainly been in a position where developers sort of write off the value of a daily stand-up or the retrospective process or the demo. But the important part about those things is not that, the individual from their standpoint, personally always gets value out of those things. It's that it brings the team together to understand where everybody else is at and offer varying opinions on how to solve for blockers or how to solve for a really, really hairy thing that they can't otherwise figure out or have been stuck on for a long time.
Yeah.
So I think that's especially on team-based projects, to make sure that the team is connecting and collaborating and moving forward in a way that has them all sort of directionally correct. I think that's a message that, for me anyway, has generally resonated.
Yeah.
And even if they sort of begrudgingly agree that, okay, yeah, these things are important, generally they start to see the value of them. On smaller projects, I have found that you can have a lot more flexibility in that sort of communication and management style, especially if people can work on independent parts a little bit.
Yeah.
But and I will say that in my career I've generally been pretty lucky. I haven't worked with probably more than a very small handful of developers who haven't really seen the value in the role.
Yeah. Well, and it's not just that. For me, I mean, like you said, sometimes people can translate their personal issues onto the team, right? Like, why do we need this sort of thing? Why are we doing these things, right? When they're really saying, why am I doing these things?
Right.
But it seems more legit when I say we.
Right.
It doesn't sound like I'm a selfish bastard when I say
But I speak for the group.
But I speak for the group. Have you talked to the group?